Hello, everybody. I'm Amara Nash. Welcome to another Living Room series and especially another Lost Classics Roundtable hosted here at CCA. We're excited to be soon, hopefully, hosting more programming in person. It seems like the world is opening up in a way that'll allow us to do that. But for now, we're so happy you're here with us virtually. Of course, with our wonderful team of Lost Classics Roundtable experts. We have Joan Tewksbury, the wonderful screenwriter, filmmaker, and just wonderful human. We have Mara Fortes again, who is a scholar and expert on film and watching many, many films and festival feverishness right now. And then, of course, our wonderful Paul Barnes, editor extraordinaire. So we're so happy to have you all here with us tonight. We do have a poetry reading on Instagram Live next Thursday, I wanted to mention, with Emma Gomez. That's going to be really good. And with that, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to the experts. Oh, I will say though, we of course welcome your questions and answers. So a few ways you can do that. There's a reaction button at the bottom of your screen or a raise hand button. You're welcome to use that and you'll kind of pop up to our view. You can also just jump in, unmute yourself. And if you're feeling a little shy or more comfortable writing, you can also write them in the chat or the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. All right, thank you all so much and I'll turn it over.
Okay, well, welcome everybody once again. Joan and Mara, you have to unmute yourselves. You're still muted. Okay, there we go. So welcome everybody, and the three of us were really happy to select The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum for this evening's program. It's a prime example, I think one of the great examples of the new German cinema that arose in the 70s and continued through the 1980s in Germany, with a remarkable group of filmmakers, Volker Schlondorff and Margareta von Trotta being two of the most prominent and most accomplished of the filmmakers that came out of this movement. I think I'm going to ask Joan. I mean, Joan selected the film, so maybe she could tell us her reasons for choosing The Lost Honor and what she so appreciates about it. And maybe that'll get us off the ground discussion-wise.
I think that I chose it because it felt so relevant to right now. And from Amanda Knox to the news that came out yesterday about Princess Diana's, the BBC interviewer coercing that interview, to the times that we are living in now that are so fraught with opinions and wrong identifications. And also because I love this filmmaker and I love how he joins the personal with the political in a way so that we can identify with those characters and all their behavior that isn't maybe extraordinary, but it's real. And so I always feel like I'm a part of those films, and also just to see the terrain of what was happening at that period of time after the war. So I would say that my love of his work is really about it being relevant still today. And we had also discussed trying to get Circle of Deceit, which would be a very relevant film to look at now because of what's going on in the Middle East. But I also love the sort of ordinariness of the casting, that it's not movie stars, it's nothing glamorous. They're attractive people, but they are real people. It's not something that is too far outside of us. So I think that's why.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. A little bit more background on the political climate in Germany that might be helpful for people that's of interest is, you know, in the 60s, it was only basically 20 years after World War II. And immediately after the war, the German people basically had tried to shove down Nazism and deny it and you know, forget about it and push it under the rug. And so this new generation of younger folks in the 60s were suddenly beginning to question their parents about what had happened in the past. And, you know, what was the war all about? What was Nazism all about? And this group of young radicals began to emerge in the 60s that were very uh, frightened by the fact that the German political scene was becoming more reactionary in a way and returning to a more repressive kind of fascistic society that they were very afraid of. In 1966, for example, the Social Democratic Party, the ZDF, joined forces with the more conservative party, the CDU, and created what's called the Grand Coalition. And this kind of unholy coalition of you know, Democrats with conservatives, they elected former Nazi party member Kurt George Kiesinger as their chancellor in the mid-60s. And so the left, especially, and the intelligentsia in Germany were kind of shocked by this. And they were shocked by the Social Democratic Party kind of giving in so easily to these conservative impulses once again. And so what inflamed the student radicals at the time was this fear of the rise of fascism in Germany again. And so that fostered, you know, the Baader-Meinhof group, which was the militant radical group that emerged in the late 60s and early 70s that were much more militant than anything anybody saw in the 60s. Because they were robbing banks, they were bombing buildings, they were burning down department stores. Their actions were really quite extreme, and this climate of fear was enormous in Germany at the time because of those actions. And consequently, what happened was that this conservative media mogul, whose name was Axel Springer, sprang up with this empire of tabloids. And the main tabloid was a newspaper called the Bild Zeitung, which would inflame the public with all of, you know, the real events that were happening with these radicals, and also a lot of unreal events that were happening with these radicals. And so that was the kind of climate with which the new German cinema began to grow out of. And that was also, you know, The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum is based on a Heinrich Böll novel, the Nobel Prize winner. And it was Böll who kind of really got Axel Springer incredibly mad when he wrote an essay that was very critical of what was happening in German politics at the time. This essay that he wrote kind of, again, was really created this inflaming kind of situation that was happening. And it really upset Springer, and Springer attacked Heinrich Böll, basically calling him a terrorist sympathizer. And so, I mean, it was, again, just this explosion that was happening at the time between the left and the right. And because of what was being printed in the tabloid by Springer, Böll and his family were subjected to police harassment. They were subjected to unwarranted searches and wiretaps. And Böll's response was basically to write The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum. So that's the background that the film comes out of. And it turns out that Schlorndorff and von Schade were friends of Böll's. And they got wind that he was about to write this, and they immediately approached him and said, "We would like to make a film of it, you know, because it's so relevant to us at this time." And so Böll immediately agreed to allow them to adapt the book. Even before it was published, they began to adapt the book into a film and put it into production. So that's kind of the background of what was happening at the time. And it was also this questioning of youth in Germany was really very strong at that time. And the more they were finding out about the real history of their Nazi background, the more inflamed and disgusted and sickened they became by their own history. And so this radicalization that happened amongst the German youth and the Baader Meinhof group and other German intellectuals at the time were all a result of looking at what the truth was about what had happened in the past that people had been burying for 20, 25 years at this point. So that's the background of where the story is coming from.
I believe we have a raised hand from Jacqueline Frank. I don't know if Jacqueline, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, so I think the other sort of part of the background is the gentleman caller who is she meets in the church, and I think it's kind of alluding to the rising power of the Christian Democrat Party, which was also kind of centrist rightist. And the other thing that I thought was kind of curious, if you remember in the '72 Olympics, that when the Munich Olympics. Yeah. And if you remember in Kevin McDonald's film, those of you who saw it One Day in September, how the German police in fact were portrayed as extremely bungling to kind of the surprise of the West, because they were still coming from this notion of this heavily militaristic Germany, which actually they had done such a thorough job of demilitarizing kind of post-war that they were in a mess. And so that's also a background of what this police stuff is that's going on, is that they're trying to rebuild themselves. They almost seemed like the Stasi in this film, which seemed kind of, at first when I was watching, it was like, wait a minute, is this an Eastern? It was like, no, because in fact, the German police, it's like there's so much kind of subtlety of what was actually going on in Germany at that time. All the strands you talked about, Paul, and all this other stuff, and they just kind of captured, I mean, they're brilliant, but they really captured a lot of stuff that was going on there,
Yeah, definitely.
And the beauty of Schlierndorff is that in the capture, it is not overstated. He simply lays things out. He shows you things. He lets you he lets you formulate the complexity that's going on without telling you or leading you in some direction. You can see this film. I hadn't seen this film for God, how many ever years, but I was enthralled in the same way as I was in the very beginning. And also because everybody's problems are the same as all the time. There are affairs going on and marriages and bad divorce, and this in the midst of all the complexity. I mean, it's politics on politics on politics in every aspect of it. I really think he's pretty marvelous in that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a remarkable ambiguity that's built into the film script, I think, which is quite extraordinary. It's the man, Goten, Ludwig Goten, who is accused of being a terrorist at the beginning of the film.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, it's never quite explained. It's just this broad label of, he's a terrorist and we have to get him, and they find out that he was with Katharina that night. And so all of a sudden Katharina is implicated, but it turns out that, this label of terrorist was put on him by the tabloids, by the press. And it's not even true, because it turns out he was an army deserter who may have stolen some money from the regiment. He had nothing to do with political terrorism. So again, it's this, the press's lies, which creates this hysteria and fear that all of a sudden implicates Katharina, who, had met, there was a spark between these two people one night that was, could be very real. It was somewhat innocent. Obviously there was a deep attraction that happened between Ludwig and Katharina that evening. but then she becomes accused of being, a collaborator with the terrorists, being a prostitute, of having, bad morals. I mean, the tabloid rips her to shreds. I mean, it all, and then the collusion that they show between the press and the police, because the main inspector is giving information to the press, and then the press is giving lies to the police. I mean, it's like this web that's happening in the course of the story is so entangling, to the point where, you don't quite know what to believe or not to believe. And, trying to escape from this web almost becomes an impossibility. As the story goes on, you just feel worse and worse and worse for Katharina. And people approach her with, you can get out of this if you do this, you can get out of this if you do this. And she is so fiercely her own person that she refuses to play their games, which almost digs a deeper grave for her, in the course of the story, because there's really no escaping. When you're a person of integrity, as she is, and you get so entangled in this, it's almost impossible to find your way out. And that's what's so terrifying about the film, in a way, as you watch it go on, and the fact that it's kind of centered in this potential love story. It's there aren't that many scenes between Katharina and Ludwig, but there's a tenderness in them that's quite striking, that makes you believe in a kind of love at first sight aspect that could have happened. And that possibility between these two people is completely destroyed by this web that they become entangled in. I mean, it's just heartbreaking, and horrifying, to contemplate being caught in such a situation. Yeah,
it's interesting that you mentioned the tenderness, because that's a powerful moment in the film where she insists, when they ask her about this guy, he showed me tenderness. And I find it really interesting that this film, which was co-directed by Margareta von Trotta, and I read that Volker and Margareta had a lot of differences as to how to portray, particularly the character of Katharina. And I think you can sense, the interventions of this feminist filmmaker in there.
Yeah.
But the tenderness thing, it was also because you constantly see Katharina in these rooms crowded by men. I think the most impactful one for me is when they search her and she has to get naked in the bathroom, and one of them tells her you have to leave the door open. So in a way, because it's so much a film about surveillance and how you look at things, but there's also the male gaze and the sort of objectifying of the woman's body is also very palpable. And so the fact that she says he showed me tenderness, she's also saying he's the one man who hasn't seen me as an instrument to something, or hasn't tried to fit me into something. So I did a little bit of reading on Margareta, because I think New German cinema is often very much described as the boys' club of Fassbinder, Herzog, but there are a few women. And I read that it was with this film that she then decided to go and make films on her own, because there was much friction. But she also mentioned that she saw Wanda, the Barbara Loden film, and that inspired her as well in making this film. And if you think about this, the 70s, early 80s, there's also Jeanne Dielman. There's these films that feature a quote unquote passive female character, but it's not really passive, but just the idea that things happen upon this person. And I don't know, I just wanted to mention it because it's I'm always attracted to those characters, because a lot goes on, they become screens for whatever is going on. But I also find it interesting that in the 70s, early 80s, feminist filmmakers were kind of using that device of these characters that are encoded with different meanings throughout the film.
Yes. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I do think, I was reading too, and Margaretta's feminism was a strong aspect that she was fiercely protective of in portraying in the film. And that was a part of the friction between her and Volker about it. But I was also reading that in many ways she was, in terms of the collaboration as co-directors, she was handling the actors and what the actors were doing, while Volker was handling the technical aspects of the direction much more. So she was more involved with the psychology of the characters in the play. And she kept moving Katharina into a more feminist kind of frame of mind, which is, you know, where her defiance comes from. You know, I mean, she's this interesting mixture of innocence because she's caught up in this horror, but at the same time, whenever the men confront her and try to control her, or try to get her to go their way, she's defiant. She won't do it.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that some of that, you know, was brought to the script by Margareta. You know, and if you look at her later films, the solo directorial efforts that she made, you know, I mean, the feminist line in all of those films is incredibly strong. She had a really remarkable career in that regard, of examining this aspect of women in German society and in German politics, you know, for the major part of her major films, for sure. So it's really a fascinating part of the film, I think.
It's also interesting that the women have space to be and to be fierce. And in the United States, the female directors at that time, we had to be very careful about how far we pushed in. There wasn't very much space for the female characters, maybe to put a toe in, but not to have that kind of fierceness. You would be, your producers would wonder how far you were going with some of this stuff. And Paul, as you talked about what was going on in Germany at that time, all I can think of is Fox News and the past president. And we are embroiled in now, and the lies that keep continuing. Right. And so the film, I mean, the film to me just sort of makes you acutely aware that this is not new news. Right. I mean, we have been fighting these fights for all of our history, and just we changed the clothes, you know, wear different clothing. So it's
Axel Springer is the Rupert Murdoch of Germany at the time. You know, for sure.
Oh.
We have a hand up from Marcia Swiss.
I'm Ron Costello, Marcia's husband. I was very beguiled by the fact that, despite the feminist themes, that here's a woman in this character, in Katharina's character, for whom everyone seems to be feeling in love. There's so many men, so many of the characters, the attorney, obviously the wealthy industrialist.
Yes.
All of them have this very tender kind of reaction to her ex-husband also as well. And I'm wondering how you reconcile that dimension of her character with the other aspects of her role in the movie.
That's interesting, but they all do start doubting, I think. You know, you do see them at some point, kind of, you see the encoding of what they're reading in the tabloids start to affect. But I also found it really interesting that there's a lot of moments of self-scrutiny where she's looking at her face in the mirror. So, you know, there's this sort of idea of surveillance, but there's also this self-surveillance where she's staring at her face, kind of thinking, what do they see in my face that makes them think I'm guilty? And what do I don't know. That doesn't answer your question at all, but it was striking to me that there was so much of that in the film. and there's, I was also thinking about how they meet in the context of a carnival, and everyone is wearing some sort of disguise, and the two people that are not wearing a costume it's she and Got, who actually don't even know anything about, they're like the mysterious figures, and I think they have to be so that they can be encoded with all these kinds of meanings. But I did have I don't know if I noticed that much tenderness aside from the lawyer, because to me the interrogation scenes just all seemed very aggressive. And for me, what stood out was the kind of tacit solidarity between the women, whether it was the aunt or the police woman, who seemed more kind of trying to protect the Katharina in those scenes. But
yeah,
to some,
it's interesting when the aunt comes into the film. Both the police and the press start to do to her what they've been doing to Katharina.
yeah.
It's like the aunt is trying to be, tell the truth about her niece, but nobody wants to hear that. They just want to. But now they start to portray the aunt the way they've been portraying Katharina. I mean, at the same time, distortion is going on.
The harder edges come in. Katharina is the love object in her youth and her. She's not vulnerable, but there is an innocence about her that men feel perhaps that they can, engulf her or take care of her or fall in love with her. And the scenes, I don't know how to put it exactly, but there is a turn at some point with the women who have been protecting the men in a way. And then there's a point in it where there's a shift that occurs to try and protect her instead of what the police stand for, what the male patriarch is standing for. But I think as I looked at this actress, I kept thinking of Amanda Knox. And she is not the greatest beauty in the world, but there's something very intriguing and mysterious about her that this actress has as well. And so it's maybe that is the seduction for men, the mystery, to discover what's inside of that. But it's I was very aware that there was a shift with the other women. They stopped being so protective of the patriarchy at one point.
And I think it's also because, with all the men, she has some sort of transactional relationship, right? Whether like she cleans their house or, she dances with them or, except as a mistress, and with the women, she doesn't, so I think that also kind of stands out. There's some comments in the chat about the carnival and costumes. Barbara, I don't know if you want to, I don't want to put you in the spot, but if you want to speak live about.
I just thought that the costumes were very visually interesting, that they added a lot of visual textures to the movie. If you think about what the movie would have been like without the costumes, it would have been very gray and bleak. And also there were a lot of scenes where there were enormous numbers of people in the frame, even in the certainly in the party scenes, but also in the police station when she was being interrogated, there were always like 8 people around, which was similar to the Japanese movie that we did a few weeks ago, where there were always, the detectives there were always like a dozen detectives in the room, when things were going on. And this was very similar. I wonder if maybe that was kind of a fad in that time. I don't know. But the costumes were were amazing. And I even noticed that some of the policemen were getting into costumes in preparation for the weekend in one of the scenes. And you saw them in kind of a locker room, putting their costumes on. So that was it was really fascinating.
Well, I kept thinking again of Amanda Knox. Every time she would be taken somewhere, there would be a host of men. And it was almost like a curiosity to see what this young woman was going to do or what she was all about. There is a sexual, Mara, you mentioned the gaze. I mean, there is definitely curiosity to see who this prostitute or whatever they want to call her is, So it's interesting about seduction in the film too.
And I think on some level too, because I also found the device of the sort of carnivalesque really fascinating, but I think in some maybe not so conscious level, you see anyone with a uniform, whether it's the police or the priest, and you think, wait, but who are you really? Or even the main character, you're playing like this innocent person, but who are you really? So I think it kind of visually makes that question be at the edge of the frame constantly. And yeah, it also crossed my mind, like, what would the film be without this crazy background?
Yeah,
I know, it's true. I mean, I wonder why they chose to create the time frame for the story during the carnival. It's an interesting choice. It really is. And I suppose it does have to do with reality and illusion and
yes,
truth and not, and questions of disguise and who is behind the mask.
right.
I mean, at the very first, in the early part of the film, when you first see the Arab, I kept going, an Arab. They hadn't really established the carnival, and you see this guy dressed as an Arab, and I think, is he really an Arab or what? He didn't seem like an Arab. I mean, it was like, it's sort of right from the get-go. The film is asking you to question who these people are. Are they real or not real? It was very interesting. And I was actually fascinated with the scene that Barbara described, where in a break in the interrogation, you do see that locker room, and there's a policeman trying to put on an Arab costume and two policemen dressing as women behind him. I mean, it was a funny, odd little moment that adds an interesting texture to the film that was quite striking in relation to setting it during Carnival. So I think they took a good advantage of doing that.
I kept thinking of, are they following her? Are they plainclothes policemen? Are they dressing up in costumes? So, I mean, it opens up a lot of doors.
And I think, I think in the book, sort of and the film, but the theme was, on the one hand, I think it was originally subtitled something like The Origins of Violence, but also how ordinary people become guilty through the press. So it's also like, oh, that might seem like a regular civilian, but he might be colluding with the
exactly.
Red Army faction, or
everybody
that kind of
colluding with everybody in a way. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh.
I know. Actually, could we take a look at one of the clips we picked? And again, this goes back to the kind of relationship between Katharina and Ludwig that kind of fascinates me. Amara, if you could play the second clip, which is the flashback between Katharina and Ludwig about his name. Could we just play that for a minute and then maybe talk about it after?
Du heißt Katharina?
Und du?
Ludwig.
Ich habe schon lange nicht mehr zu einem Mann du gesagt.
Wie lange?
Oh, 4 Jahre. Ja. 5. Ich habe natürlich Kollegen, mit denen ich mich duze, aber
Ich bin kein Kollege.
ich weiß. Ich freue mich so. Ich habe ein bisschen Angst.
Angst? Wovor?
Weiß ich nicht, wenn ich das wüsste, dann hätte ich ja keine Angst. Ich war mal verheiratet und das ging gar nicht gut. Lass uns bald weggehen.
I mean, for me, it's such a wonderful scene. It's so short, but so well done, I think. I love the fact, I mean, it's what you were talking about, Mara, with Katharina at the mirror. You know, I mean, that's when she came home after the first interrogation. She has to take a shower. She feels so dirty. But she picks up the flower. And that was the one carnival thing that she wore that night, was the flower behind her ear. So that's what she picks up that reminds her of Ludwig, you know, and that prompts the flashback. And then if you look at the flashback, they're kind of on the left and right of the screen. They're kind of separated at first. And as the scene goes on, they talk about calling him by his first name. The camera moves in and a slow zoom in. And Katharina moves into Ludwig in the same slow manner. You know, it's like, and Angela Winkler plays it so beautifully. You know, you can see how attracted she is to this man. You know, it's all over her face. She's so happy to have met someone. And even her body language, that she's the one who's moving in towards him. And then she puts her arm on his shoulder in this really interesting way in terms of the blocking. It's a wonderful, wonderful moment. And that's where you can really sense that there was a kind of potential between these two people, you know, that's being destroyed by what's happening, by this unreal situation they've gotten themselves into. I mean, I just think it's a very, really lovely moment that, you know, puts a real spin and twist on the story in a very interesting way.
And do you know, Paul, if there's a question from Diana, if the novel is also set during the carnival, or if that is something that the filmmakers added?
Actually, I don't know. I haven't read the novel. I don't know. Joan, do you know if it's set during?
I can't remember. I can't remember. No, I don't know.
Just a technical thing about the German. What she's actually saying to him is that in German, as in many Romance languages, there's a formal and an informal you. So what she's saying to him is that I haven't called a man using the informal you. She doesn't say your first name. She's like, it's like, you know, there's an informal and a formal you in German. So what she says to him, I haven't used the informal you to a man, which means that with her gentleman caller, who she's been seeing for 2 years, she's using the formal you.
Yes.
Right.
So it's indicating the intimacy by using the informal you on short acquaintance. That's very different from sort of first name. It's a deeper thing when languages have formal and informal you, which Mara, you probably in Spanish. So it's that same thing. So the translation was a little bit off.
Interesting.
The German
but it's too complicated to do that in it because people wouldn't know what you were saying. You know, I haven't used the informal you. You know, so they were kind of right to do that, but it doesn't actually convey, you know, what's going on there.
Right. Oh, that's it. Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's fascinating. That's great.
I was going to comment on that also, that the Germans actually have a word for that, the duzen, which is to be able to call someone du, which is the second person. I don't know whether the Romance languages have such a term.
They do. In French, it's tutoyer.
In Spanish, it's tutear. So it's the same.
It's the same thing. Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Translational kind of issue in the film.
Well, also the paper, the newspaper, which is called Die Zeitung, which is the Times. It's not the paper, it's the Times.
Mhm.
So why they call it the paper as opposed to the Times, I don't know, but Die Zeitung actually means the Times.
Right. Well, they were probably trying to protect our times.
Probably. I do know that they weren't allowed to use the actual name of the newspaper in the film.
Right.
I think there was a lawsuit or some sort of legal action.
Yeah, exactly. Right. For very good reason, I think. Right. Are there any other questions, Amara? Has anybody else put any questions out there that we could answer?
No, I don't see any in the chat.
No? Okay. All right. Could we do one more clip that's, I think, really interesting, especially to Mara and I? Again, it involves Katharina and Ludwig, and that's the phone call. Can we take a look at that and then talk about that afterwards? Because I think it's really a wonderful sequence in the film. Amara, can you show that? The third clip, the phone call?
Hallo? Hallo? Bist du's? Hast du es gefunden? Geht's dir gut? Ist da überhaupt was zu essen da? Mach dir keine Sorgen. Ich lasse uns in Ruhe. Ich weiß, aber ich musste einfach deine Stimme hören. Du. Ich hab dich so lieb. Ich möchte jetzt so gern bei dir sein. Gestern Nacht war ich schon fast auf dem Weg zu dir.
Ruf nicht wieder an. Ich melde mich schon. Du hast mir doch verboten, von Liebe zu sprechen. Ich will dir aber trotzdem sagen, dass ich dich sehr, sehr gern habe. Ja, ich dich auch. Sehr.
Oh my word. I remember watching this again and, again, having forgotten much of the film because it was so long ago, that when it cuts to the wire, it was such a shock for me, to realize that the police had gone that far that they had wiretapped the professor's home, so that they could listen in on the phone call. And again, it's this wonderful moment of intimacy between Katharina and Ludwig. There's a great hesitancy between the two of them, and still this kind of desire to want to speak to each other, and but it's all broken, by this police surveillance that's going on. Again, it's a very simple kind of a thing, but there's a shock to it that's really quite, it really hits you in the gut. At least it did for me. And even again in the staging is beautiful because she goes to the phone, the light is on in the room, but the directors have her turn the light off so that she has to speak to him in the dark so that nobody from outside can see the phone call happening. It's almost like Katharina at this point wanting to keep everything hidden, and not be seen in this kind of intimate phone call. it's really beautifully done, I thought, but also incredibly disturbing.
Yeah, and I think there's such a brilliant use of space in the film that the kind of you're constantly made aware of how the looking is mediated, right, through the cameras, and that this moment you as a viewer you think, oh, finally she's gonna get to be alone, no one's watching, she's gonna call her lover. And then I think that's the sort of disturbing part, is when you see the wire and you realize, oh no, she's being surveyed. But I was very struck by something Margareta von Trotta said when they asked her about New German cinema, and she was talking about this generation that grew up was born during World War II or the tail end, and was faced basically with two general reactions to the war. One was complete denial, where they didn't even learn about it at school, and the other was everyone is guilty. And between those two, the thing is, there's no accountability. So I think the whole film, in a way, is how to translate that accountability in visual terms. And the more obvious ones, that how the camera is weaponized from the beginning. You don't know if you're looking through a rifle or a camera. But it made me read this scene differently, because it is a very voyeuristic scene. If you think about it, you're kind of, as a viewer, you're pulled into this very, very private space. So I think it's also a way of making the viewer complicit. It's like this accountability also includes you, the viewer, who is now part of this web of constructed truths. I don't know. It was just seeing it again with that.
You're absolutely right. It's the complicity of the audience with what's going on. It's very Hitchcockian. And again, reading about Margareta, finding out that Hitchcock was one of her big influences. So again, those kind of moments, I think, were things that Margareta might have drawn from him in terms of influencing the film. Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Jacqueline has.
Yeah, I wondered whether you remember when the undercover cop, the Arab, where he described their meeting as a reunion. So I wondered if there was like this deliberate ambiguity throughout the film as to whether or not it was a reunion or a first time that they met, which this scene to me sort of reinforced a bit. I was just, do you remember that when he said that he described their meeting as a reunion? And so I wondered whether they were throughout the film kind of had this ambiguity about whether they actually did know each other before. I don't know. I felt at this time that there was sort of ambiguity there around all that, and I assumed, of course, that it was her apartment that was bugged Paul, not the house. That's how they figured out where he was by bugging her phone, which led them to the house. Yeah, they didn't know where he was because they didn't know yet who the gentleman caller was because of his prominence. At least that's the way I understood it.
And there's also the very deliberate thing of not actually letting you hear what the two discuss at the party, right? And that's when they discuss probably something about where he could take up refuge. Like there's just this complete ellipsis as to what transacts between the two.
There. A lot of ambiguity, yeah.
You're right. That may be true. I didn't quite read it that way. Huh. Interesting. Right.
There are some glaring deficiencies in the plot line. If the German police were so careful, how did they miss finding her weapon? Her gun. Her gun was in the drawer, in the desk drawer.
Oh, right. Well, at that point, no, she was at the aunt's house at that point.
I don't think so.
Not at the end. She was in her own apartment. The phone call was from her aunt's house.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
Let me ask you this. I found the whole denouement almost artificial, given the sensitivity of this woman. Was she really capable of firing those shots, or did they just have to end the film in some way? I don't know if that portion of it is in the novel, not having read it.
It is in the novel.
It is.
But in the novel, the murder apparently appears right from the very outset, and the rest of the novel has to do with interviewing various parties with a great deal of ambiguity, apparently. So Rashomon-like ambiguity. Yeah. It sounds like a very complicated, interesting novel, but the film takes a very different tack.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I mean, it's interesting that we're all second guessing because everyone is unreliable. But you know, I did think at some point that for the police, she was never related. They could never see her as someone with the agency of violence. So they were just kind of manipulating so that they would find where the guy was. And so, you know, I don't know if you have this saying in English, but you kind of find what you're looking for. So they weren't looking for a gun, therefore they probably missed it because they were looking for. I don't know. That's sort of how I would justify, but it could very well be a plot hole. But
yeah, who knows? For sure. Could I read you folks just one thing again? There was a wonderful review or essay about the film written by Amy Taubin, who is a wonderful American film critic who writes for Film Forum and a number of other film comment magazines. When the film was re-released on DVD by Criterion in 2003, she wrote this beautiful essay about it. And one paragraph stood out to me. She wrote, "The most disturbing aspect of Katharina Blum, though, is its portrayal of the collusion between the police and the right-wing press in demonizing not only terrorist suspects, but also anyone who questions the counterterrorism policies of the government." I mean, that's really a very strong statement that comes through in the film for sure, I think. And it's also kind of reinforced by, you know, the last scene in the film at the funeral, you know, when the editor makes his speech about, you know, how right they have been to pursue this case this way and portray Katharina the way they did. And that final title card, which I just wanted to read to you folks again, which I think is a great piece of writing. "All characters and events are fictitious. The description of certain journalistic practices are neither intentional nor accidental, but unavoidable." You know, it's such a great twist on that paragraph we've seen in so many films about, you know, based on true events, blah, 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 you know. But in this case, it's neither intentional nor accidental, but unavoidable. I mean, that is really, truly damning about the distortions that, you know, a press can create in these kinds of political situations. You know. Yeah. Any other comments by anybody or anything else?
I wanted to say, you know, it's interesting that both Schlondorf and von Trotta, they've made, you know, they're very interested in making historical films, and they talk about how when you make a film, regardless of whatever historical moment you're depicting, it's always a film that has to speak to the present, you know. And I think, you know, Joan framing it in relation to the Amanda Knox and Fox News is, you know, a measure of the success of their work. But they also start from this question, or at least von Trotta does. She claims that she starts from the question of, if she were to ask her characters if they would choose to live in the time that they did. And I think that's it's interesting because in a way they're not films, or this one at least is not a film that is talking about history in broad strokes, right? It starts always from the individual and the, you know, the person and their immediate environment. So I think that, yeah, it's just something I wanted to mention, because it's a good way to think at any film, you know, at the characters of any film. Like if they had a choice, would they choose to live in that time? Because that immediately bridges whatever time you're describing in a film to whatever time we're
Yeah, no, it's true. It's really fascinating, you know. I think Katharina would choose not to.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. We're getting close to the hour mark. Amara had put together a wonderful montage of photographs of Volker and Margareta that I think it might be interesting if our audience saw what these folks, these two wonderful, talented directors, what they look like, if Amara could play it. It's a nice little montage of the two of them. You know, they both really did have remarkable film careers, working in feature films and documentaries combined, which is also unusual for many filmmakers to cross into both territories. You know, for those of you who enjoyed this film and might want to see something else, I would highly recommend Margareta von Trotter's Marianne and Juliane, which is about two sisters, one of whom is rather conservative and straight-laced, and the other of whom becomes one of the anarchists and militant anarchists, you know, much like the Baader Meinhof group, and the relationship between the two sisters. It's a fascinating, fascinating film. I think it's a great film. And Volker, of course, made the adaptation of The Tin Drum, which won the Academy Award, as you saw him holding the Academy Award there by the Hollywood sign. And it was the first, actually the first German film ever to win the Oscar, was The Tin Drum. So if you're interested in these filmmakers, I'd recommend, you know, both of those films to you if you want to continue to see what their career is like. But there is many other, like Circle of Deceit, that Volker made, which Joan and I admire enormously. So they're fascinating filmmakers if you're looking for something new to want to follow up on this film. Any last comments or questions from anybody, or any no? All righty. Well, listen, thank you all once again for attending. Just so you know, next month in June, we're planning to change things up a little bit. We're going to show you a classic American comedy instead of all these heavy political dramas we've been deluging you with. It's one of my favorites. It's Preston Sturges's The Lady Eve with Henry Fonda and Barbara Stanwyck. It's one of the all-time great comedies as far as I'm concerned. So I think we can have a lot of fun talking about that genre of American filmmaking and Sturges's work in particular, because I think he's one of the greats. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you all again next month. Adios.
Ciao.